Hello, this is Philip Cargom. Welcome to Tea with the Druid 158. I'm recording this just after the summer solstice. No, just after the winter solstice. And so it's pre-recorded, and I've got a treat for you today. Today, it's a completely different format. What Tea with the Druid is going to be is the interview I had with the author John Matthews a couple of weeks ago and recorded, some of which has appeared on Druidcast, the podcast of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, who brings you this Tea with the Druid. Welcome, by the way, if you're watching this as the recording, and welcome to everyone. Now, so normally the show is about 20 minutes long. I talk for about 10 minutes, and then there's a meditation for 10 minutes. But we're going to do something different. We're going to have this interview that I had with John Matthews, the film of it. If you've heard the interview on Druidcast, then buzz forward about 50 minutes, and you'll find that the interview carries on, and I start to talk about tarot decks, and I start to show the various tarot images from the beautiful decks that John has been involved with. So do enjoy this interview. And next week, Roma Johnson, who you might have seen the lovely home blessing she gave us all a few weeks back, she's going to be on Tea with the Druid, and then the week after that, I'll be live. Okay, so I hope you had a lovely Christmas and many, many blessings. Hello, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to be talking today to John Matthews, known to many of you, if not all of you, I'm sure, and known to me for about 30 years. We met John, didn't we, about 30 years ago?
About that, at least. Yes, it must be. Yeah.
Thank you for finally agreeing to talk.
It took 30 years to persuade me.
30 years of persuasion. But in fact, we've been meaning to do this for years, haven't we?
And it's true, yes.
And it's the usual thing with friends, is you always say you'll do something, and then it takes you years to get around to doing it.
I know, and every time I bump into you, which is quite frequently, we always say, we really must do, and then it never happens. But I'm pretty glad it is now anyway.
Fantastic. So what I think a good place for us to start really is for me to just say to you, or ask you, what got you started on all this?
Wow. Well, I mean, that's both an easy and a difficult question to answer, because I guess I always had a natural psychic energy. It was something I used to see things all the time when I was little. And my mother would spend half the time telling me not to imagine I had too much imagination, or of course there's nothing there to be afraid of, or, when I would say, what is that little man over there and what's he doing? And she couldn't see it. Of course, I had no idea what that meant at the time.
And where was this? What's the setting?
It's in the outskirts of London, where I was born in Southgate.
Right.
Which is North London.
Yeah.
I have, I was in and around London, well, until about 30 years ago when I moved down here to Oxford.
Great. So you're in Southgate and your mum's telling you this. What's your dad saying?
He wasn't saying much because he wasn't around very much.
Right.
They were not together.
Right.
Most of my life, in fact. I used to see him once a week because he was a dentist. He had a dental surgery practice in Harley Street, and we would go up. My mother was his nurse, and so they would be busy in the surgery, and I'd usually hang around outside and watch the clients coming in and out. And
gosh, so you sort of hung out in a dentist's waiting room once a week?
It wasn't even the waiting room, actually. It was on the stairs. It was a very grand house, as all those houses are in Harley Street, and there were all kinds of celebrities upstairs. So people would come past me and say hello, and I'd be reading as usual.
Yes.
And it wasn't, in fact, until, I'd been doing that for a couple of years, I suppose. And this very pleasant and elegant gentleman used to come past me almost every time, ask me what I was reading and so forth. And then suddenly, out of the blue, my dad got 2 tickets to a concert. And it turned out that the gentleman in question was Sir William Walton. Composer, and we went along to hear what was my first classical concert, Belshazzar's Feast. Absolutely blew me away.
And you were what sort of age then?
I was probably about 11 or 12, maybe, something like
Right. Yeah.
that. But I absolutely loved it. And so I had this strange life of, very ordinary life, and with occasional extraordinary things, and always being aware of things that weren't there for other people.
Mm.
And this went on until I was 15. And on that occasion, I was visiting my dad, who lived in Worthing. And I'd heard about this fascinating place called Chanctonbury Ring, which had a Roman temple on the top of it. And I thought I'd really like to find out about that, because I was already interested in history. And so I borrowed a bike and I cycled all the way from Worthing to Chanctonbury, which turned out to be quite a long way. As I got there, the night was falling. And but I decided anyway, I've got this far, I'm going to go on up. Well, as I went up the hill, it got darker and darker. And finally, when I was near the top, it was so dark that I couldn't really see. At this point, I noticed a fire amid the trees, because there's a lot of trees on Chanctonbury. I'm sure you've been up there.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I wonder what's going on, and with all the bravura of a 15-year-old curious boy, I went over and I came into a circle of trees, and there was a fire in the middle, and there were people sitting around it. And one of them got up, came over towards me and said, "We've been expecting you." And of course, now, if I'd been sensible at this point, I'd have gone, yep, turned around and run for it. But I was just curious, because it's an extraordinary way to be greeted. Well, to cut a long story short, it turned out that these people had been meeting, they were part of a group that had been meeting there, they said, since the Middle Ages, same families from the local area, and that one of their members had died recently, and that someone had had a vision to say, a boy will come at this hour, at this time, on this day, and you should welcome him and offer him a place in the circle, which they'd never done before. Yeah. They're absolutely local down to the roots, So anyway, they explained all this to me. Then they invited me to sit in the circle, listen and watch. And I did, and I saw them chanting, and I saw them doing stuff that nowadays would be recognized as elemental magic. And, they would be now seen as Wiccan, but they thought Wiccans were recent people who just came along recently, and they didn't, they weren't very impressed by them.
Was it anything like, you're presumably familiar with Wiccan ceremonies? Was it anything like Wiccan? Were they sky-clad?
Occasionally, but not particularly in this instance. I did ask about that once, and they came, the person you would call the high priestess in a modern society group looked at me and said, "With the weather here, are you kidding?" Yeah. So yes, they were occasionally in the summer, but in the winter there were robes.
Right.
And I mean, a lot of what they did had parallels with modern Wiccan procedures. And I mean, no offense to any, modern Wiccan people who are listening or watching this, but to these people who were, I suppose, would be classified as traditional, this was a recent interest among people. They'd noticed there was more interest suddenly, and this must have been the time when Gerald Gardner was getting busy, and the whole idea was beginning. The Witchcraft Act was repealed, and there were more people interested in it.
So give us an idea of the year then. If you were 15, how
that would be, hang on, I was born in 48, so 58,
63. Okay. Yeah.
So it was still in the early days, and I remember me saying, "What can I read? What to learn?" Because I wasn't there, I didn't live in the area. I still lived in London. So they said, "Well, there's only one book at the moment to read, and that was Evans Vance's Celtic Faith." I forget the title.
Fairy Traditions or something. Yes.
It was that one, and it was a standard work. And they said, "Don't believe every word you read, but at least he came and talked to people." And apparently he had talked to them.
Oh, really? Yes.
So though most of what he did was in Ireland, but he had come over to England as well. Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, that was the title.
That's it. Yes. Gosh, so did you, after that first ceremony, so I mean, what did they do in that first ceremony? Because you're a 15-year-old boy, you've just arrived, so it's an extraordinary scene to stumble upon and to be welcomed in that way. Can you remember what the sort of ceremony was for? Was it?
What I can remember was that they worked a great deal with the seasons and with the
Mm,
natural world, obviously. And
mm,
it was mostly people from a farming community.
mm.
So, they weren't towners, if you like. They were
Yeah.
very much country folk. So I remember there was a lot of singing and chanting, which was very beautiful.
Mm,
And it was singing to make the year turn, to make the wheel turn.
mm.
This would have been, I think, probably around about March or April. Not
Right.
quite sure of the exact timing now, but
Yeah.
it was certainly a time when the season was changing, was beginning to change. So there wasn't anything more than that. I mean, I saw much more dramatic things later, but that was the beginning. So that was a kind of easing me in, if you like.
Yeah.
At the end, they said, "We'd like to invite you to join us," and I was fascinated.
Mm,
I said, "I live in London," and they said, "No, it's all right. When we're going to have a meeting, we'll send you a note,
mm.
and just come if you can."
Yeah.
So for the next 3 or 4 years, every few months, I would get a little note
Mm.
through the post saying, meeting next week.
Yeah.
It was all terribly weird and hush hush. And of course, I had to always say to my mum, "I'm going down to see Dad,"
Yeah.
and I'd go and stay with Dad in the surgery, in his surgery, because he had another one in Worthing.
Yeah.
And then then I would go off to Chanctonbury and be there for most of the nights, really.
How extraordinary! How fantastic! And so, what was? Was it a solstice you went to the next one, or?
I think so. It's going back quite a long way now,
Mm,
obviously, and some of it's not very clear for me. I did write about it a few years ago, and again, quite recently, there was a conference up in Scotland, traditional and various kinds of esoteric lore. And as it was no longer live, it was a virtual one. I wrote a piece for it, which I think they published online. I can find the details if you want to have a look.
yeah, well, that's great. We'll give the link if you. We'll give the link in
Absolutely.
addition to the broadcast. That would be really fascinating for people. When you said that they became rather dramatic, the ceremonies, can you give us sort of an idea of?
Well, the most dramatic one ever was when our leader, I can't tell you her name,
Hmm.
but she did a dance in the circle, skyclad,
Mm.
and she cut herself all over with knives. And I
Gosh.
saw this, and I saw the blood running down,
Hmm.
and then afterwards there wasn't a mark. So, and I hadn't just had mushrooms or anything else. It was what I saw was what I saw. So that was the most dramatic. I mean, most of it was, I guess you'd say, quite low key, in the sense that we did things like there was a woman in the village who had been telling stories about people, and I was trained how to go out of my body
Hmm.
and float along to her house and hover outside her window
Hmm.
and influence her to stop doing this.
Gosh.
No curses or anything. It was just, don't do this. And
Yeah.
apparently it worked.
Right. So
So
they didn't teach cursing.
no,
No.
it was
But
very,
it was.
I never felt any really negative energies from them at all. I mean, they were human beings. So obviously there were occasional arguments and disagreements and that kind of thing. But there was a general feeling of a community, of friendship, and of sharing this unique view of the universe, really. I mean, they didn't have goddess names.
Hmm.
They referred to Im upstairs and downstairs. Those are the phrases used.
Upstairs and downstairs.
So it was like the above and below.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, and Im was the god upstairs and was the goddess downstairs. But they, when I tried to draw in some kind of modern terminology, they always look at me blankly. I remember saying, "Do I need an athame?" Because I'd read that you had to have an athame.
Yeah.
And my boss turned to me and said, "You've got a perfectly good finger, haven't you? Use your finger. Point. It's your intent. It's not what you're holding."
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there was no kind of stuff like that. People didn't have wands or athames or anything like that. They didn't wear jewelry or any kind of sign that they were any different to anyone else. which is maybe how they managed to be, avoid being noticed for such a long time. I don't know.
How extraordinary. Did they cast circles?
Yeah, well, yes. There was a protective circle made, around within the tree group. We always met at the same place.
Up on Chanctonbury Ring.
Chanctonbury Ring. And we were very aware of the fact. They weren't speaking, but we knew there was another group on another hill at some distance from there, which I believe was the one run by Dorian Valiente.
Right.
But they felt that was a very different tradition, and they didn't speak.
Oh, right.
But there was always the same place. And after I left eventually, I can tell you how and why if you like. It's quite dramatic again.
Yeah, no, do.
But I came. What I wanted to say was that I did then visit it again, but maybe 10 or 15 years later.
Yeah.
And I saw that there was still a fire ring, and it was very obvious that people were still meeting there. But I didn't see any of the group. And when I went to the local pub to ask if so-and-so was actually around, I just got blank looks.
Yeah.
The blank looks that you'd give if a photographer or a journalist came,
Yes.
But no, I left. This is all I've written. I've written about all of this in the essay that I told you about. But basically, when I tell this, it still sounds dramatic to me. But anyway, they had discovered that I had the natural psychic ability. And so they said, we want you to be the focus for a big piece of work. We want to call the Guardian of the Hill. And nothing more was explained, just that was what they wanted me to do. So they put me in the middle of the circle, next to the fire. Everybody else was around in a circle, and they were chanting and singing. And I was just going out. I literally left my body and floated away up into the air. And at that same time, I saw something coming out of the hill itself. And there's no way I can make this sound any less dramatic than it does, but it looked like a huge figure made of shadow. There was no face, there was no form to it. It was just roughly humanoid. And it came and loomed over me and said, now, was the voice I heard in my head. And I just said, no, with as much force as I could. And at that point, I came out of the trance. Several people in the circle fell over, fainted. There was such a blast of power, apparently, from that point. And basically, a little bit after that, I was politely asked to leave.
Really? So when you say that this being said now to you, he, she, or it wanted to take you over, or was that the...
I can only assume that. And that's what I felt instinctively. And my instinct was to say no.
You had to say no to sort of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when I told this story, I haven't told this story to very many people, but I told it to Olivia Durden Robertson years later. And she said, "Oh, my dear, they were going to sacrifice you." And I said, "I don't really think so." But she said, "Well, you did exactly the right thing anyway." But it felt right at the time, and there was no animosity. It's just that they said, this is not right. It's not working, basically.
Yeah.
And so they asked me if I would leave, and I did.
Actually, why do you think they wanted to, when they said they were going to call the Spirit of the Hill, what did you think they wanted to do?
I think it was something to do with, it had been a bad harvest that year. And I think it was the time-honored thing of you wanting to ask a spirit of power to aid you in that way. And I mean, since then, and with some of the work I've done with R.J. Stewart and others, I've learned that, there are places like that have their own attendant spirits. And sometimes they were people who were buried there or left there alive to have their spirits basically attached to the place. And I'm assuming it was something like that. But there wasn't, there was very little explanation, if you know what I mean. We didn't talk about things in a theoretical way, we just did them. So
I think it's funny.
This week we're going to do this. We're going to silence the gossip in the village or whatever it was. This one, we're going to summon the Guardian of the Hill, and you're doing it, basically.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when I was that sort of age, sort of 16, 17, 18 and training with Newen in Druidry, when I look back, I think, why didn't I ask questions? Why didn't I? But
exactly.
People just told you things and you sort of did them. I think when I look at our children, I mean, your Emeris and our children, um, they're so much more self-possessed nowadays, I think.
Process.
And I think when we were young, we sort of did as we were told and just listened. And but so what happened then when they asked you to leave and you left the group? How did your life change then? You were about 18 then, something like that?
About that, 18, 19, yeah, thereabouts. Well, basically, I just stopped. I stopped doing anything because I still felt quite shaken by the experience.
Yeah.
This, being, whatever it was. I mean, it was very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And I still think to this day that if I'd agreed, it would have taken me in somehow. And I don't know what would have happened.
Right.
But I said no, and I left it. And I think at that time I was working in a public library. And I started reading the books. This is the thing, they were that was the point in time when suddenly there were loads of new books about witchcraft, about the occult, about all of this. So I grabbed all the Golden Dawn stuff, and I grabbed the Druid stuff and anything else I could find, really, and just read and read and read.
We're talking about the end of the 60s now. We're talking about sort of 60s.
Yeah. So there's quite a bit around by this point.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there was more already, even when I was part of the group, but they were always saying, don't bother to read any of that stuff. This is the only one they would recommend, was the Evans Wentz. But anyway, I was now reading omnivorously and picking up as much as I could, but I wasn't doing anything. I tried not to, quite consciously, in fact. I would still occasionally see things. I remember the library I was working in was in Chelsea. And I remember coming out of the library entrance one day and looking across the road, and I saw a man standing in the middle of the road, and a bus came towards him. And I had my mouth open to shout, "Look out." And the bus just drove straight through him, and he was still there.
Gosh.
So it's like, classic exorcist stuff, but it didn't happen like that too often. But I just remember those things. And I didn't really do very much until I was moved to another library, and I walked into the staff room one day, and I saw this woman who was sitting in the staff room talking about the Mabinogion. I went over and I sat down and I said, "Oh, Mabinogion, that's really interesting. I've read that. I'm interested in that." And we got chatting, and this turned out to be Kathleen. So, it brought us together. I told her the story. We eventually settled down together, and she got me to join a couple of groups that she was a member of at that time. And an amazing old lady called Madge Worthington. I'm sure there's someone out there will remember her. We were briefly a member of her coven.
Oh, right.
And that was interesting because, again, for me, that was, other people do that, but not the same as we were doing it.
Yeah.
And I was a bit of a 9-day wonder because the members were always coming to me and saying, "Did your lot used to do this?" Or "Did they have that to say?" And in the end, I mean, this is a bit naughty and I probably really shouldn't say this, but I got impatient with it. So I said, "If you stop asking me questions, I'll give you a chant from Chanctonbury." And I made one up on the spur of the moment. And I said, "Don't tell anyone else. It's top secret." Well, about 5 years after that, I met someone from Australia who said, "I could tell you this chant, but it's top secret. Don't pass it on to anyone else." Guess what? It was the one I'd literally plucked out of the air. So I know that's a bit naughty. I haven't done that lots of times. If those of you who are listening or watching, I'm not conning you. But it was just a moment, a flash of, "Oh, please stop asking me questions,"
And a bit of research as well, I suppose, because you discovered what happens, when you do that kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it was just interesting that it did pass through. So somewhere in the world there are a bunch of people doing, ceremonies using that chant, and it was by me. But anyway, so I mean, meeting with Kathleen meant that she was passionate about all this. She had her own natural psychism too. We moved in together, then we got married, and that's really that is, to answer your question in the beginning, that is really where it begins for me. I mean, all those other things were preludes, but having someone to work with all the time, 24/7, living that life, living that world and that knowledge and that wisdom and sharing it, was how we got started.
Yes, exactly, because the two of you together have been, it's obviously been such you've created a sort of powerhouse of working together, and the amount of books that you've both been able to produce, and obviously sort of firing off each other. And did you, at what point did you, I mean, when did you get your first book contract? How did that work? Had you always wanted to be a writer from a young age?
Fairly, yes, I had. I'd actually always wanted to be a novelist.
Right.
Oddly enough, although I've written 2 or 3 novels, they're all for children. I've never really gone in. I started writing a great Arthurian novel, which I think I've told you about before.
Mm.
And I started it when I was in my early 20s, and I'm still writing it. And maybe, if spared, it will eventually get finished.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it was, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I mean, the first thing I did when I was working in the libraries was I met a friend called Graham Beresford Young, who's a poet, and we became very good friends, and we founded a literary magazine called Labris together.
Oh, right.
And we did about 8 issues.
Yeah.
And we did specials on Lawrence Durrell and George Seferis, and we had all kinds of really top writers writing for it. Kathleen Rain, who became a very good friend, I know that you knew too, was a very, very, supportive of all that. And so I think I always knew that I wanted to write. I mean, I'd written stories when I was a kid. I still remember the first story I ever wrote, which was a haunted house in which a boy goes into the house and the floorboards give way and he falls down into the basement and it's full of skeletons. But that's all I can tell you. But
yes, that's right.
I know that was my first written attempt to write something.
And what sort of age was that, do you think?
Oh God, probably about 8 or 9, maybe.
8 or 9, yes.
So I set up to do it. But the first one was, I got my first contract in 1979, and the book, which was The Grail, Quest for the Eternal, which was in Thames and Hudson's Art and Imagination series, came out in 1981. And I got that quite by accident, because one of my friends at the time was a Sufi scholar named Peter Lambourne Wilson, who lived in Chelsea as well. And I can't remember how we came to meet, but we met, and probably Sue Kathleen, actually. And we became quite good friends. We used to go for walks. We used to talk a lot. And he was doing a book on angels, a fabulous book on angels for Thames and Hudson. And he heard that they were looking for more writers to do more numbers for the Art and Imagination series. And he said, well, there's only one person you should go to, and that's John Matthews, because he knows everything there is to know about the Grail. So I put in my 3-page proposal and heard back in a week. And they said yes, and they offered me an advance of £800, which in those days was quite a lot.
Yeah.
I went, okay.
Yeah.
And I wrote the book, I think, in less than a year.
Yeah.
And I still remember going into Thames and Hudson. Those were the days when, you went in with your manuscript and handed it to your editor, and they sat down and looked at it while you were in the room. Terrifying.
Yes.
I'm sure you remember this happening maybe to you. But and I can't now remember the name of my editor. I thought it was someone else, but he tells me it wasn't him. But anyway, he sat me down and he went, right, yeah, very good. Now go away and rewrite it.
Oh no.
And I went, what's wrong with it? And he said, go away and rewrite it. Wouldn't tell me anything else. So I went home, sat down, read it again. I thought, it seems all right to me. And I left it a couple of days, and then I read it again. And suddenly I began to realize that there were bits that I'd missed out. There were things that I hadn't joined up, if you like. They weren't coherent. Because after all, it was the first book I'd ever written.
Yeah.
So I just binned the manuscript, which I now would never dare to do, but I did at the time. And I just wrote it all out again from the beginning, took it back in, and he again sat me down in the chair, looking through the page. He says, okay.
Isn't that interesting? Because I suppose, have you ever read a book on how to write a book?
I once looked at Stephen King's book because I was curious.
Because I remember,
I thought it was brilliant. I thought all his information was absolutely extraordinary, but I'd already been doing that from the start.
I know. I remember after about 10 years of writing books, thinking, I wonder if there are any rules to this. I wonder. And I remember reading a book on how to write a book. I can't remember what it was, and picking up a few ideas, but and thinking, oh God, why didn't I realize that? But so was it when you were editing Labyrinth that you came across oh gosh, J.P. Travers, is that, who wrote
P.J. Travers.
P.J. Travers.
P.L. Travers.
P.L. Travers, yeah.
Coppins, yes.
Yeah.
No, I didn't come across her that way. I came across her through Kathleen.
Yeah.
Right, because we used to visit Kathleen quite often. She was only 15 minutes away from us. And she often...
You mean Travers? You used to visit Travers?
No, Kathleen Raine.
Oh, Kathleen Raine. Okay, sorry, yeah.
We used to visit her. She lived in Portland Square. We were only a few really half a mile away. And so we often visited, both of us. And in fact, she became a kind of honorary godmother to Emrys when our son was born. She had a little party for him, and she made a cake with a stone circle and icing on the top.
Oh, fantastic.
I have pictures of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, but no, she said, oh, there's someone you really must meet. Because in the next square up, and I forget which one it was now, but it's the next square up along on King's Road, you must meet, and it's P.L. Travers. So we went along, and we had the most bizarre evening, because P.L. Travers was very eccentric, as you probably know. And I can't now remember where the conversations went, but almost every time we made an opinion about anything, she would say, oh, no, that's absolutely not right. No. And then she'd give us her version, and I think I'm not sure whether the movie had come out at that point, but of course it's very famous, the story. They made a film about it, that she really hated the whole thing and hated the music and all that sort of stuff. But I remember that we talked mostly about mythology and folklore rather than about Mary Poppins, because she knew an immense amount. She wrote a book called What the Bee Knows.
Yes.
I don't know if you ever read that one. It's
no, I know the quote, ask the wild bee what the druid knows.
Right. Oh, well, she'd adapted it to be What the Bee Knows.
Right.
And it was really a selection of essays about folklore and myth, and it's one of my favorite books. I read it every now and then because she was so perceptive and so understanding.
Yes.
So yeah, we had that was a strange encounter, as they say, but fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. How fantastic. And when so the first book that you were that you got the commission for was a book about, a subject that has become a passion for you and you've written lots about. Why is the Grail so important to you?
Oh, that's quite a hard one to answer. I mean, I had been interested in it for quite a while before I wrote the book. That was why Peter Lamborn Wilson said, that they should go to me for that book, because I knew more about it than anyone else he knew.
And you were what age? Can I just ask you, just so I can sort of place it? You're still working at the library.
Yeah.
And you're what sort of age?
I'm about in my late 30s, I think.
Late 30s. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes.
And I'd written, I mean, apart from editing Labyrinth, I'd written a few essays, a few articles published here and there, some poetry, but not really anything else. My friend Graham, whom I founded the Labyrinth with, moved down to Frome, and he became the mayor of Frome and opened a bookshop and ran a small publishing company down there called Brands Head.
All right.
And he and I did a few things together. He published actually, I suppose it was just before the Grail book, so I'm thinking non-commercial then, but he did a collection of poetry called Merlin in Caledon that I wrote. And I still have some copies. It's that, so I suppose that was really my first book. That must have been around about 1979 or 80. So yes, I'm still at the library, married to Caitlin by this time, and working together in all kinds of different ways, and meeting interesting people.
How fantastic. But so, and which came first, your fascination for the Grail or for the Arthurian mystery?
Arthurian first. I can tell you exactly when that happened. That was when I read T.H. White's Once and Future King. Until that moment, I'd been writing a book about Vikings.
Oh, really?
That was what I thought was the most exciting thing I could write about at that time.
Yeah.
When I finished Once and Future King, I literally, not in a bad way, in excitement, threw the book across the room, jumped up and shouted upstairs to Caitlin, "I've just discovered what I want to write about."
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, I'm not sure Caitlin was there, but anyway, maybe it was another friend. But I knew that in that moment, I decided that was my subject. So I started, I went to Kensington Library, where I later worked, and I found that they had a folklore collection, which was reserved, but you could get access to. And suddenly I was in this huge room with hundreds of books on folklore and mythology. And it felt like paradise. And then I went to look for Arthur, and I found there were 2 bays of books just on that subject. And I remember you're allowed 6 books, and I took the 6 biggest and heaviest I could find, brought them home, read them, devoured them, made lists from the bibliographies in the back of things I wanted to read again, went back, picked up another 6, and so on. And I read pretty much everything on those 2 bays in the next 2 years, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
It was just that, I mean, I was reading other stuff, but it was that obsessed and fascinated me. And at some point I decided I wanted to write this great novel, and I started working on that. And at some point then, around about that time, I found that the Grail was the key to everything else. If you didn't have the Grail story in Arthur, you just had a Dark Age warrior who got the people together, saved the country, blah, blah. But there were some magic bits in, and it was the magic bits that interested me. I will say that I've always been more interested in the myth of Arthur than I have in the history of Arthur, although that fascinates me too. But it was the Grail that I felt was the key, because the Grail is present and it also breaks the round table, because it's all the knights going in quest of the round table and only very few of them, 3 of them, finding it, and all the others either dying or disappearing. That reduces the round table to a few of the famous ones like Gawain and Lancelot, and allows the enemies like Mordred to come in and take over and destroy it and end Arthur's reign. So without the Grail, that wouldn't have happened, I think, or it would have happened differently perhaps. But that was the starting point. And then I started looking at what is the Grail. Now, obviously, the first thing you see when you start looking for the Grail is the Christian symbolism. It's the Eucharist, it's the cup of the Last Supper, it's the Holy Grail. But I'd already read enough Celtic material at that point to understand that that was simply a later aspect of it. It went back much further than that. Since then, in more recent years, I've discovered it goes even further back than Celtic. In fact, into early Hebrew tradition, which is something I'd kind of seen but dismissed as being not so relevant. I was obviously very deeply enmeshed in Celtic lore and legend by then.
And do you see is there some link between the early Celtic use of it in the old stories and so on, and the cauldrons that we find, and Middle Eastern or Hebrew mythology? Or
yes, well, I mean, the thing that I was most interested in at the beginning was the Celtic cauldrons, because you had the cauldron of Anu, the cauldron of rebirth. You had all these different things, and they obviously performed the same function. The Grail, whatever you mean by God or goddess, whatever you mean by deity, the Grail is a hotline. All the versions of the Grail that I've read are about that, one way or the other. So first of all, I saw the Holy Grail as a hotline to the Christian God. Then I discovered that the cauldrons were hotlines to Anun, to various other places in the Celtic cosmos, and to other beings. And then it's only really in the last 10 years that I became interested in the whole idea of Joseph of Arimathea, tracing that back to the temples of the Grail. The book I wrote recently is the first of a 2-part study about the Temples of the Grail. And when I started to study it, oddly enough, it took me back full circle to Peter Lamborn Wilson, because Peter had given me an essay to read by an American scholar called Arthur Upham Pope. And Pope had found an old manuscript that virtually no one had looked at on the Grail, which described the temple where it was held. And there were two things about this. First of all, he noticed the very close resemblance to the Temple of Solomon in description. Excuse me. And the second thing he noticed was that there was an actual site in what is now Azerbaijan,
right,
that resembled the description in the poem almost exactly. So he was an Orientalist. He was very highly respected, helped to found various groups in this country and in America that study the magic and the esotericism and the traditions of everything from Zoroaster to the more recent things. And he organized an expedition, and he went out to the site and he took photos of it and he measured it, and he found that the detail was incredibly accurate. This poem had somehow, in the 12th-13th century, we're not sure of the exact date, had somehow seen, the author had seen the place, perhaps even visited it. Because one of the things you notice in the poem, most medieval poems are told in the second person. But suddenly, when you get to the description, he says, and I saw this, and I felt this, and I experienced this. And I think that means that either the poet writing it, whose name is usually given as Albrecht von Schaffenberg, but that's probably a pseudonym, had actually either been there or talked to someone who had been there, because suddenly it leaps into focus. So looking at all this side of the history led me to look again at the whole Solomonic mysteries. And I found that there were an immense number of parallels. And I found that the poem that most people think was the first poem about the Grail, which is the Conte du Graal by Chrétien de Troyes, it actually describes the Temple of Solomon, the Holy of Holies, and there's the Grail inside it with the wounded king and all of the other characters that appear in that. So that, in a kind of way, brought me back full circle, as I said, to looking at the Grail from the beginning. And this is at the moment the earliest form of it that I've been able to find, is what is found in the Holy of Holies. And of course, it is once again a hotline to God.
Yes.
So there are elements in the Holy of Holies, obviously the Ark of the Covenant, but within the Ark itself are things like the rod of Aaron, a cup, and a stone tablet, all of which exactly correspond to the four hallows in the Grail legend. So lots of things like that.
How extraordinary! Now I have in my hand the Grail Tarot. Your publisher sent me this wonderful. Does some of this come into the Grail Tarot?
A little bit, not so much of the newer things, because this originally was done a little while ago.
Yeah,
actually a reissue.
Right.
But no, I mean what the Grail Tarot does is to look at the Templar aspect of it.
Because the Templars were very much connected to the Middle East, weren't they?
They were very much so. And one of the most interesting things that I found, I mean, I don't know how much of you've read on this, and some of the listeners I know will probably have read loads of things like Dan Brown and the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail and all of that. And one of the things that comes up again and again is that the Templars, when they made their base in Jerusalem, went into the basement that had been part of the original temple looking for a treasure. Now, there's huge amounts of argument as to why they were doing this and whether they found anything. That's another issue altogether. The point is that they described this place that they went to as the Stables of Solomon. Now, when I was researching the Templars of the Grail book, right at the end, so I didn't have time much to put much about it into the book, I discovered that there was another site within a mile of the one that I thought was the Grail Temple, and it was called the Stable of Solomon. So I think actually that the Templars went there and were looking for something there, whatever it was.
how extraordinary, and I mean, I can see from these the beautiful artwork in these cards. This deck is evoking this how can we describe it, archetype or atmosphere of both the Middle East and you know the Holy Land and the Grail and the mysteries of the Grail in the most sort of powerful.
Well, you see, with Solomon, I mean, I put in quite, and I think some of it was unconscious. Yeah.
Yes. So even though you were working on this before you got onto all of this stuff, the seeds of it were there, weren't they?
Yeah.
And yes, no, this is so. Is the Temples of the Grail, the Temples of the Grail book that's come out, has it?
That's out from Llewellyn.
From Llewellyn, and did you say it was one of a series of two?
Well, I'm doing another one at the moment, which is part 2, because one of the things that really most excited me, I don't want to give away too much, but one of the things that I discovered, the poem, by the way, that I referred to, which describes the temple, is called Titurel. And
it's called what, sorry?
Titurel.
Titurel, yeah.
And who is the original Grail King. He's the old Grail King. All kinds of miraculous things happen that enable him to build the temple. But this poem, Titurel, is a very, very long poem. It's something like 60,000 lines, and it's never been done into modern German. And the third part had never even been edited from the manuscript.
Good heavens!
The guy who was doing it in the 19th century died before he could finish it. No one took it on, and somebody ages ago, back in the 40s, I think, read what he had done and said, "This is the most boring medieval manuscript I've ever seen. Don't bother reading it." And ever since then, it's been ignored.
Right.
Entirely. One or two people have picked up on it.
Even by Himmler's Ahnenerbe.
Even by Ahnenerbe, I suspect that the guy who they were employing, Otto Rahn, may have known about it because he seems to have read everything. But what was so interesting about this was that in the esoteric groups that I belonged to over the years, particularly the one run by Gareth Knight, I used to be told the same thing, that Prester John, that is the priest king from the far east behind the east, was the guardian of the Grail for our time. And I'd always assumed that this was an idea that had been brought up by A.E. Waite, or one of the Golden Dawn people. And I thought, well, there you are. Charles Williams wrote a novel called War in Heaven about the Grail, and Prester John appears as a young man in a charcoal grey suit who has magic and power. And I loved all of that. And I've been fascinated by the Prester John story and had thought about writing a book about it. Then, when I was doing this research into Titurel, I found someone who had made a summary of the third and final part of the text. So it wasn't a translation, but it was a detailed summary. And in that, guess what happens? The people who built the Temple of the Grail, they start worrying about what's going to happen to it. You know, will someone come and steal it? So they make a copy, and they send the copy to Accra, which is interesting because that has its own story about a mythical cup or a semi-mythical cup. But the other one, they say, we have to take this to the Far East and beyond. So they set off on a journey and they encounter Prester John. And they say to him, Sir, will you take on the guardianship of this cup? And he says, tell me the story. So they tell him the story and he goes, all right, then I'll take it. So there is actually a medieval source for this idea that Prester John is perhaps still somewhere the guardian of the Grail.
Guardian of the Grail.
So the second book is all about that and a few other things that I won't talk about here, but that I'm working on along with several other things. Hopefully will come out in the next year or two.
Great. We'll look forward to that.
But the thing I would like to say, by the way, about the Grail Tarot is that it is designed a rather unique thing. I don't think anyone else has ever done this. If you lay all the cards side by side, they have no borders. And if you lay them side by side, beginning with the Fool and then all the four suits together, they tell the story of the Grail.
Oh, how fantastic.
So you can use it in more than one way. You can use it as a standard tarot.
Yes.
where you can work with the Grail magic. And a lot of in the book you'll find stuff about how to work with it in that way, that it actually tells you the story. And each of the suits is about a young novice
Hmm.
in the order who wants to find the Grail. So each suit is a little separate journey, and the major is a big journey, and the whole deck is the great journey.
Oh, how wonderful. I think it's marvelous when, to use the tarot for more than simply its oracular use, but also as a teaching device as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because so that's available through Schiffer, isn't it? That's published by Schiffer.
It is, and I understand that copies are in the warehouse here, so it is distributed here.
And then I've just received the Byzantine tarot, which
oh yes,
looks absolutely extraordinary, and I haven't even.
Gosh, how restrained of you! How restrained!
I know. I've restrained myself specifically for this event, so I'm ripping it open now. Fantastic. And again, it's the production values, as they say, are just wonderful. Yeah. So it's illustrated by Scylla. The Grail Tarot was illustrated by Giovanni Caselli, yes, who I met at your birthday party, didn't I?
No, this is another one. I've actually never met Giovanni. You met you met Andrea Aste at my birthday.
Ah, okay.
Very Italian, but no, actually, because Giovanni doesn't speak English, and my Italian is not good enough for the kind of conversation we had. I would give descriptions of stuff, be sent off to him, and his wife would translate them for him. So, but I never actually got to meet him.
Oh, you never met him? Oh, right.
Because all the work, every single picture in the Grail Tarot is based on traditional work from the Middle Ages.
Yes, yes.
We drew and photoshopped and, collaged. So, when you're looking through them, if you know about medieval art, you'll go, oh, look, that's from so-and-so, and so on.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yes, no, it really resonates.
I couldn't tell you which ones those are, but,
yeah,
he knew, obviously. So
this one too, the Byzantine Tarot with illustrations by Scylla Conway. This looks absolutely superb as well, and this has come out. And how different is this one?
Well, this is more of a standard tarot. I mean, again, I'll tell you the story of how it originated, because Scylla and I met at a launch for one of my other books at Watkins shop in London.
Right.
And we got chatting, and she said, oh no, I said, I've always wanted to do a Byzantine tarot. And she looked at me and she said, but I've always wanted to do a Byzantine tarot. So we looked at each other and said, well, should we just do it then?
Yes.
So that was
wonderful, because she's done her intuitive tarot, hasn't she?
She has, and she has a new one coming out called The Ancient Gods, which is absolutely amazing. And most of them she does herself. Yes.
Yes, they are. The artwork is.
She went out to Greece and to the Middle East and painted those in the places where they were actually, the actual icons, and they're all based on actual icons from the Byzantine tradition. So
they glow, and even on the computer screen you can see them glowing, can't you? How fantastic!
But the outline of it is more or less follows the kind of standard, Rider-Waite, or occasionally I use the Marseille for a lot of my things. I tend to mix the two. But of course, at the time, there was no concept of the tarot during the time of the Byzantine Empire.
Yes.
So but a very interesting thing did happen. You had a big outburst of people known as iconoclasts, who said that you could not paint pictures of God or Jesus or any of the disciples. You could only use abstract.
Right.
And one of the empresses, I think it's Helena II, I'm not quite sure, I may be wrong on that one, said, no, it's fine. You can do it. I give you permission as the Empress of Byzantium. Go ahead. And the point is, if she hadn't done that, we probably wouldn't have the tarot. Because, there would have been the iconography would continue to be, as it still is in the Middle East, parts of the Middle East.
No representations of the human form. Yeah.
So we thought very much that within the scope of the tarot itself, it was good to celebrate the fact that we might not have a tarot if we hadn't had a Byzantine empress who said this.
Yes.
So then, of course, I started researching, and Scylla had already done some research herself too. And we found that the archetypes of the tarot were all present. They were all there.
Within Byzantine art.
Within Byzantine art, yes. There
Yeah.
wasn't any concept. There wasn't a set of cards. There were no specific meanings in that way. But what I'm saying is that it was very easy to apply the tarot archetypal forms and meanings to images that already existed. So, for instance, there's one in there for the lightning struck tower, which actually does show a lightning struck tower, which is an image that existed.
Yes, yes, exactly.
In the deck there, you'll find it.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, we looked at the organization of the Byzantine world, and it's the court particularly. It had a very complex court. To this day, people still say that, you know, if a place or a person is Byzantine, they're saying very complex and a bit crooked. But at the time, it was all kind of backstabbing and trying to get to the top of the ladder and all of that. Very familiar stuff.
Yes.
And so we were able to adapt, you know, the swords and the cups and the rest of it, you know, to make it fit together very well, we felt. And as I said, Scylla's work, absolutely extraordinary. The fact that she went to the trouble of going out there and you know, painting them in the spot and more sketching and then painting them back when she got home and so on.
Yes, absolutely beautiful, absolutely lovely. And that's by Schiffer as well, isn't it? And then you were telling me when we had a phone call the other day, you were telling me about your latest project, which sounds extraordinary.
Really? Well, here it is. My turn to hold things up. It's the Tarot of Light and Shadow.
Yeah.
And this is one that I've done with Andrea Aste, whom you met, and who's a fantastic Italian artist. He did something called the Book of Shadows Tarot, which was very successful. And he first met Kathleen when she was on a tour in Italy. They really got to like each other. He was fascinated by my work. And so when he moved to Britain, we got together and we've become very, very good friends.
Great.
And over the years, we talked a lot about the differences in tarot and the similarities in tarot. And we began to hear a lot about people who would take a standard deck and they do a reading. And then they'd pick up another deck and they'd take 2 or 3 cards out of that and lay them next to or under or over or across the reading they'd already had and use that to moderate it in some way. So we thought, well, this is a very interesting idea, but suppose you had intentionally 2 decks that were intended to be used like that you could use one for one aspect and another from another aspect. So what we ended up with is the Tarot of Light and Shadow, and you'll see, if I hold the box up, that we have 2 decks inside.
2 complete decks in there.
78 cards each one.
Yeah.
One is the shadow deck, and the other is the light deck. And of course, we immediately ran into all sorts of problems with people saying, "Oh, you mean the shadow work, as in Jungian psychology, which you're very familiar, or the light deck is good and the dark deck is bad?" And we were going, "No, it's nothing to do with that at all." We actually wanted to call it the Tarot of Dawn and Twilight. The publishers didn't want to do that. They thought that would be too obscure. So we ended up with Light and Shadow. So I spent a lot of time over the last few weeks explaining to people, you know, that we don't mean, shadow doesn't mean negative, light doesn't mean good. What they are 2 different ways of looking at the same question. And you can use them separately, or you can interleave the whole lot, which is a massive bundle, I can tell you.
Yeah.
Even my hands can't cope with it. And you get very interesting comparisons, because when Andrea worked on this, he made subtle changes in each one. So here's a very good example. This is the Hanged Man, and you'll see there's the Hanged Man in the shadow and
Bring
the
it
Hanged Man
closer.
in the light.
Bring it closer.
When you, is that good?
Yes. Yes.
To put them together side by side like that, you'll see there is a big tree in the middle,
Yes.
which those 2 halves form. Then, if you turn it round this way, you have a forest.
Oh, yes.
So a lot of things like this. And if you look really carefully at the cards, I don't know how whether you can see all this, but there are a lot of little subtle differences. Like instead of butterflies, as we have in the light one, we have bees in the dark, and we have some bats. And so all the way through both decks, we have we have these little differences.
These differences. Well, of course, it's lovely. You know that if you do, you know, the way the light falls differently at dusk and dawn, and different shadows, the shadows lie in a different way, and things are revealed in one kind of light that are hidden in another kind of light. So I really like that, and I think taking different perspectives on issues is really powerful. So that's fantastic.
Because they're intended to be used together as well, you don't get a contradiction. It's like you don't get one answer from light and another answer from shadow. You get one that interleaves itself.
Do you have reversed meanings as well?
We didn't put any in the book because it just starts to get really complicated.
That would start to get complicated.
It would work that way, I think. What we do have, we put in 2 extra cards. In a lot of the earlier tarots, you have something called cartes blanches, white cards. And these were put in there originally to indicate significator, to indicate you. We did these ones and we made them cosmic mirrors.
Oh, yes.
So there's one for each deck. And I should have explained, by the way, that the backs of the cards are exactly the same.
Right.
If you lay them face down, you can't tell whether you've got light or dark.
Right.
But what we use these cosmic mirrors for is you shuffle them into the deck, and then you look at the cards that lie on either side of where they come, and that helps you to choose your cards. And of course, if by any chance, which does sometimes happen, you get the same card from both decks, that's very powerful in itself.
Yes.
Because when you read the meanings in the little book, which goes with it, here's the booklet that goes along with it. You get basically, sorry, go away. Sorry.
That's right.
I'll the sound off. I'll start that bit again.
Yes.
When you look in the little book, you'll see that you've got a light reading and a shadow reading for each card.
Yes.
Next to each other. So you can see then immediately how the differences are and the similarities. And it's very interesting because as soon as you start thinking about how does one differ from the other, how does one way of looking at something differ from the other, what is it about the magic of Twilight that makes it look both perhaps for some people more sinister, perhaps for others more magical, than the day, the light of the day at the very beginning of the day. And it's amazing how much, again, when you apply this to more or less traditional tarot meanings, it really qualify each other. So
Yes.
this is the first intentional double deck that we know of. We know some other tarot people who've kind of done one deck and then gone, well, maybe I could visit that place again, but they've never done it never gone into it with that idea of doing, looking 2 ways of looking at the same question.
Yes, and has that been published already?
Yes, that's out now and available from Watkins Media.
Right.
And you find it, as they say, in all bookstores and on those big sprawling companies that we don't name.
Yes.
And various other places. So, and indeed from us at our website. We also
which is HelloQuest, isn't it?
HelloQuest.org.uk.
Yes.
And that has all of that. We have copies of all of these at the moment anyway. Because I believe, amazingly, that the Byzantine Tarot is already sold out. The first delivery in this country, not sold out in the world, but in this country, it I think sold out almost immediately. So, which is wonderful. So, and we're getting fantastic reviews for the Light and Shadow. Somebody even wrote that this would change the way that tarot was read forever.
Well, that is fantastic. And I came across the idea. I think you're really onto something here. I first came across the idea of using 2 decks was when a friend of ours and colleague who runs a psychotherapy training institute told me that they were using our Druid Animal Oracle in 2 decks, and they were in workshops, and they would put 2 decks, one on either side of the room, and then they would get participants to choose one with their left hand to represent something coming from their unconscious that for them to look at, and one with their right hand, or their dominant hand rather, to choose something that's in their consciousness at the moment, and then to put them together. And I thought this was an interesting idea. So I was doing a workshop in Germany, and we tried this, and it really was having two decks, two of the same decks, you know. So I can see how working with two decks really can.
You had two whole decks.
Two whole decks.
Fantastic.
And then you took a card from some movement was built in with a group, you know, walking to one side, and it was decorated in a different way, and then walking to the other side. So it was turned into a kind of ritual as well. And then everybody shared, you know, and so on. So
similar in some ways.
Yeah, yeah.
The only thing we've got differently is the details.
Yeah, you've got these changing.
They're quite subtle. I mean, some of them are subtle, and you know, one of the other things that I do a lot is read cards like a story. You know, as I mentioned with the Grail Tarot. But if I have a reading, I'll often lay out 5 or 6 cards in a row, and then I look at which way the cards are facing.
Yes.
Nowadays, the tendency is they look straight out at you, but in the earlier traditions, they look from left or right.
Right.
And so, in this deck, for instance, if you've got 2 of the court cards. One of the kings, I can't remember which one now, is going that way in the shadow deck and that way in the light deck, and so they're going away from each other, and that's significant. But if
and then of course, depending on what they're looking at,
they're looking at each other.
Yes.
So you know, so this is something that really fascinates me too, and it's another development in this.
Yes.
We've hardly started yet. You know, there are more applications, I suspect, than we've realized.
Well, I think this, John, is the secret of eternal youth, which of course was perhaps one of the goals of drinking from the Holy Grail, is to have exciting projects that one can work on, so that even as one moves into one's maturity, one is still enthused and excited by new ideas. And I can see this working with you, and I think the test of a good conversation is when you realize it could go on forever, because there's so much to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it helps having a really good interviewer who knows what to ask.
Well, thank you, John. It's been a fantastic pleasure. We'll have to do it again. And not
in another 30 years, please. I might not be around then.
That'll be great. Well, thank you so much, John. It's been great listening to you.
Thank you for having me, and it's been great talking, Philip. You take care.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.